Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 14. I'm joined today by Zoe Duncan, author of the wonderful novel The Shifting Pools, a book about one woman's journey towards healing from incredible trauma and loss. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Strange times we're living through, but we're surviving it quite well over here, luckily.
That's good to hear. A lot of your background is relevant to the book, so listeners, we're going to get to that in a moment. But you have a background in teaching, policy advice, art and writing, and I'm obviously going to have to home in on the writing. The Shifting Pools was your first book. How long had you been writing before then?
Well, interestingly, my writing before then had mainly been academic work when I'd been teaching at university and doing my PhD. It then morphed into me writing in my own time. Stories, shorter stories, much shorter than a novel, but just putting ideas down, some poetry, some little snippets of things that I wouldn't really be able to give a particular name to. And I've always written down my dreams, interestingly, and they obviously feature in this novel, the idea of somebody's dreams. So I wouldn't necessarily say I'd written things at great length before, but that urge to write had always been there.
Well, that's very interesting about the poems, because obviously poetry is one of the things that is a big part of your book.
That's been a big influence when I was growing up. From a very young age, I'd read quite a lot of poetry, actually. And my school that I was at the time was very good at furnishing us with lots of different types of books to read. And I was quite drawn to poetry from quite a young age.
Who's your favourite poet?
Oh, that's a really tricky one. I have certain poems of different people that mean an awful lot to me. I love a lot of Christina Rossetti, a lot of Lorca, a lot of Leonard Cohen, whether written down or in his songs. So from a vast range of ancient right through to modern, really.
So, listeners, as I've noted, The Shifting Pools is about healing. Eve lives in London. She's in her 30s, but she's only really living a half-life, if that. She spent her childhood in an unnamed country, and at 11, a war tore the place apart and she lost her family in a bomb attack. She's never been able to address her grief, and now it's starting to impact her in a way she can't repress. So, Zoe, the book is related somewhat to your own childhood. Can you tell us more?
Yes, I unfortunately have had experience of quite a great deal of trauma, and war trauma in particular. I was a little bit older than the character in the book when it happened to me and my family. And we were caught up, unfortunately, in the invasion of Kuwait. So Iraq invaded. I was 14 at the time. My family was living there. And those issues really became very important to me as I got older, those issues of how you deal with long-held trauma and grief when your childhood is stopped very abruptly. And there's almost a dividing line between before and after. And those issues of dislocation and when you feel cut off from the world and almost frozen in the reality you find yourself in, they were very personal to me, but also not just to myself, but in the way I saw the people around me respond, the people I loved, other people who didn't know how to interact with my families anymore. And all of these things I was obviously picking up on and feeding into and mulling over it for many, many years before finding the right words to talk about them.
What was it like being in England? Had you been here for a long time before or anything?
I hadn't been in England for very much of my life before. I'd had little bits here and there of different houses. My father was in the army, so we'd be posted somewhere. And while we were waiting for that posting to happen, and it was usually abroad because he was a linguist, we would be put for a few months in some house in England, but it was never home. I was sent to boarding school in England when I was about 9. So my only experience of England was a pretty negative one, to be honest.
And now you live in Cornwall, I believe, in Buckinghamshire?
I live in Buckinghamshire, but we travel down to Cornwall as often as we possibly can. Obviously, that's on hold right now, and I'm missing it terribly.
I love Cornwall, so yes, I can relate to that. Shall we have a reading from the start of the book, I believe?
Yes, I'm going to read the very, very first few pages of the book, which starts off with the main central character, Eve, being introduced. And this one is called Pomegranates. Pomegranate season was her favourite time. She liked the way the fat balls would hang from the trees, dangling their temptation over the walls of gardens, enticing you to quickly swipe one as you strolled back from school. All her friends did it too, and although a few owners would come out and make a comment, most of them did so good-naturedly, disappearing back into their gardens with a small smile and a wry shake of the head. School kids. She liked the perfume that they left on the breeze, the stickiness of the juices as you cut through to the little scarlet gems, and the intricacy of mining out those jewels. She walked home without her parents now she had turned 11. That still gave her a little thrill, a feeling of independence just around the corner, the awakening of something she couldn't yet grasp. As they turned the final corner before her home, she smiled when she caught sight of her little sister Layla stomping around the garden on her chubby, stubby legs. Layla squealed as she saw Eve, her leg speed increasing to a pace that her coordination couldn't yet keep up with, sending her stumbling onto the grass. Eve swooped in, school bag slung across her shoulder, and still laughing, swung Layla around, eliciting the bubbling brook of giggles to which toddlers alone hold the secret. "Look, Layla, for you, sweetie." Eve offered up the ripe pomegranate that she'd stashed away for her baby sister. "Pom-pom," gurgled Layla, grabbing the fruit and setting off determinedly to the kitchen where she already knew help would be on hand in the form of a sharp knife and a willing family member. Eve glanced around the garden before following Layla inside. Everything was ripening. The figs hung heavy on the trees now, and little pockets of sweetly scented jasmine air were everywhere. She liked helping her parents in the garden. Not so much the cutting back and pruning, she actually rather preferred the wild abandon that the honeysuckle, hibiscus and bougainvillea strove for, but she loved seeing things that had been planted many weeks or months before, shyly peering out into the world for the first time. She heard the strains of her mother's piano playing as she turned back towards the house, and she smiled again as she wondered whether Hugo was home yet. He'd promised her a trip down to the beach with him and his friends once he'd got back from school. Eve ran up the steps of the veranda and into the house to find her snorkel and mask. The house was always full of music, whether drifting out from the cassette player or from her mother's hands at the piano. Right now her mother was playing the Enigma variations again, the notes echoing around the house. She smiled warmly as Eve came in, allowing her hands to continue drawing the beautiful melody from the keys. "Oh, I love this one, Mummy. Tell me again why this one is special," Eve said. Her mother smiled, knowing that Eve already knew, but there was a pleasure in this repetition, these little rituals. She managed to keep the music flowing as Eve ducked under her arms and clambered up onto her lap. Eve was getting too gangly really for that now, but her mother always just opened her arms a little wider and made it possible. "What is so special, Evie, is that the parts at the end are saying on paper the exact same thing that was said at the start, but the magic is that they sound completely different. When they are played out loud, they say a completely different thing." "That's not possible, Mummy." "That's the magic, Evie. They are saying something different to you because you can now hear them differently. The music has taken you on a journey, and without that journey, the start and the end would sound the same to you. But with that journey, you can hear the difference. Magic. Life always finds a way."
Listeners, if you heard that part about the music and thought that maybe there's something in that for the rest of the book, you would be correct. And we are going to go on to talk about things like that in a minute. But firsthand, I'm going to ask Zoe, is there a reason for the lack of a name of the country that Eve lived in?
Yes, there is actually. It felt quite important to me that the issues I wanted to talk about, there was a universality behind them. And I think when you name a place, you have to get into the specifics of it, and it necessarily excludes some people and includes others. And I feel that the situation that Eve faces in the book, which is the loss of her family and war, these issues are being faced by people around the world every day right now. And I felt that there's something important to be said there, that it shouldn't just be one particular conflict, one particular war zone.
It speaks to many different situations. So we've got another narrative in this book and another completely different theme in the book. There is a fantasy world, and this is Enanti, I believe. Would you say that?
That's right, yes.
Yep. Okay, so Enanti is a fantasy world that is effectively comes across as Eve's coping method. I think there's maybe a couple of different ways that you could see this fantasy world in the book. Zoe, how did you come to use the Enanti as Eve's coping method?
I wanted to use fantasy because, again, it plugs into that universality. I think when you are taken away from the strictures of writing details about a place and everyone's checking if you've got something wrong, it's quite jarring. I think when you open up a landscape that's actually fantastical, it can better illuminate reality. So the things you're trying to say and the themes you're trying to say can be done on a different landscape that's open to you. It's not constricted down by detail. So that universality, again, was very important to me. And it also allowed allegory and to plug into our fairy tale tradition. And I think fairy tales are something we're all very subconsciously familiar with. And it was almost a way of plugging into that within readers as well. And finally, one of the main reasons I used it is to highlight Eve's own disconnect from reality. Her sense of reality is extremely broken and extremely warped. And the use of a fantastical landscape helps to highlight that. And you're never entirely sure whether this is just Eve's dream world or things that she thinks about when she's in a trance, or whether it's just her subconscious. And I think that opens up the book to a lot more interpretation.
Mm-hmm. I know, rereading as well, I'd forgotten about the ending. I'm not going to talk about the ending, but definitely I thought, what exactly is it? Is there one particular answer to that question yourself for you about what it is?
That's a very good question. In some ways, I'm loath to answer it, because I do believe when you write something, you give it to the reader, and every single person that reads that book will make it their own book. They'll think their own things. They'll think of their Eve in their head and what she looks like and how she behaves in more subtle ways. And in the same way, they'll have their own reading of that. I've had one person write to me asking me if it meant that she died and she'd actually gone up to a different realm altogether. And that's what they took from it. And it was quite a religious interpretation in their view. So in some ways, I quite like that. I quite like that it's open to that. I think my main drive at the start was to really explore the subconscious and the way that reality has to be reinvented by people who have suffered trauma. So their internal reality is at very odds with the reality being played out around them. And although it seems like an odd thing to say, they may as well be living in a fantasy world. Things are so unreal to them that are very real to other people.
That's fascinating about the idea of death. No, you say about that. I did, obviously my mind got to working overtime, because I was seeing all these metaphors and, like you say, allegories as I was reading. And you do have the name of Eve. And I thought, is there something religious in that? But I didn't take that further, because I thought,
I think a few people have asked me that question about if there's a religious reading into it. And I think some people necessarily will, because their own perspective and their own prism will only enable them to see it that way for them, which is fine. I think for me, the reason I called her Eve was actually because it means life.
I didn't know that. That works very well. One of the other metaphors we have is water. Was it always to be that water was the healing element in the book?
I think it was going to work on many levels, water. It was also a window into another world. It was when she fully submerges in water that she actually first transports herself to Enanti. And it's through the mechanism of the shifting pools, which are again water, that she can move between the worlds. So there was that sense of the shift of reality. I think water is often represented as your subconscious in a lot of psychoanalysis. And I love that idea of your subconscious almost washing up onto the shore. And then as the tide goes out, what's left behind are the things actually you really need to look at about yourself. So there was that definite sense of it as being about the subconscious and also a window to another place. But there is also those wonderful meanings of rebirth. I mean, we use it in Christian traditions. It's used for christening people and to give them a new name and a new birth. But I also see it as a transporting and healing, shifting reality medium, and I think that was part of what I wanted to show.
Well, I know when I read the chapter where she's standing by the water, I mean, this could just totally just be me, but I'd read The Bell Jar not that long before, and I was also getting bits of like Kate Chopin's The Awakening. Obviously that's a completely different ending there, but the same sort of idea of the water being healing.
Yes, and I think that as the journey sort of goes through the book for Eve, her own personal journey, that is definitely what is happening, and water is really central to that.
Mm-hmm. So we've mentioned the poetry that you love and that you write, and I wasn't going to say at the time because this would be jumping on, so I'm going to say it now. You've got the style and the structure of the shifting pools. You've written the book using a variety of methods. You've got 3 types, as it were, of chapters. You've got the past, the present, and then Enanti. And various poems are spread throughout. What was the purpose of this method? Why did you choose to construct the book in this manner?
I wanted it to reflect Eve's own psychology. So the chapters at the beginning are very deliberately short and choppy and broken. And that's echoing Eve's own sense of brokenness and her own fragility, her lack of cohesion at that time. So it's about compartmentalization, which is exactly how she's constructed her life. And at the beginning, it is that very choppy things that are forcing themselves into her brain and her conscious thoughts, and she's quickly sort of moving away from them again. And as the book continues, the chapters do become longer and more sustained as Eve herself starts to change, so that it becomes a little bit more flowing. So that choppiness at the beginning was deliberately done. And the structure was done in a way where you're jumping around through time and space and first person, third person, again mirroring this sense of disorientation and dislocation that the central character herself has.
It's interesting what you said about the start of the book, because certainly when I was reading, I went, yes, as you go on, you do notice that the chapters get longer.
Yes.
Yes. So you saying that, yes, it's very interesting. Should we have the second reading?
Okay. This is from a chapter called Meeting the Wind and Taking Flight. He led me down to where the rough grass and scrub gave way to boulders and smooth pebbles on the beach. We crunched over them together right to the water's edge. It felt wonderful, fresh and invigorating. I beamed up at him, elated. I want you to meet someone, if I can call it that, he said. Who? You'll see. I'm going to head back now. Take as long as you need. You'll be safe here. I watched, puzzled, as Raoul strode back up the rocks towards the tree line. Then I turned to face the view. The sea was mesmerizing, glowing in the low sun's light, luminous and alive. I drank in the sight of the surface, and then I allowed my eyes to focus down into the water, to see fish in vast numbers move as one, their metallic sides flashing as they moved, to forests of seaweed rocking ceaselessly in the unseen currents of the deep. I wanted to dive down into the depths there and immerse myself in the dark water. You can do that whenever you fancy. That is your world too, down there in the depths. But for a moment, stay with me. I glanced urgently about, having seen no one else on this desolate stretch. The voice had seemed to reverberate around me, coming from every direction at once. A voice carried in on the wind. Almost, laughed the voice, pure as a breeze. I am the wind. I know you, Eve, and you know me. Yes, was all that I could manage. I knew it was true. I felt it deep inside, as absurd as that seemed, and so many things were not as I had thought them to be, now that I was less closed off to these possibilities. You did it, Eve. You flew for a moment. I was there as you did it. I cradled you. You may not have felt me, but I am a part of the air, and so I am everywhere. I felt you, I whispered, remembering the slight push I had felt under my shoulders as I had stepped off the cliff to try to fly. Just a nudge, but enough to help me to half believe I could leave the ground. You always will. You are also part of me, part of everything. Whenever you step into me as yourself, you can be the one that enables yourself to leave the ground and start to fly. You will be within me, I will be within you, because there is no separation. You can inhabit all these parts because you are of the elements, as are all things. You are life. Do not be encumbered by what you think. Learn how to live free by what you feel. You can soar to the highest clouds. You can dive down to the unimagined depths of the ocean. You can flow down the mountainside and the river. You can tremble with budding life within the soil, and you can blaze within the fire, and you will feel it all. Don't shy away from that feeling. It is what gives you life. You are not them. They are not you. You are parts of them all, and you live among them. I quivered with the power that those words evoked in me. They landed in the core of me. My wings, which I had not yet learned to stow away, arched into life on my back. I stretched them and flexed my shoulder muscles. So dark and quiet on my back, they blazed as the refracted light from the sea bounced off them. They shone with colour, dark cyan, cerulean, aquamarine, indigo, teal and turquoise, all tipped with deep eagle green. They beat the air, and I rose without any effort at all, feeling the power flood through me. It was an incredible rush.
We've kind of got the use of time in the, well, as we, in the flying section, we're in Enanti, and Eve is told that when she's there, no one's going to notice. It kind of reminded me of Narnia in that way. And then, of course, you've got the time that Eve takes to grieve, and the further time in London, and also in her dreams and things. Was time something you were thinking about when you were writing?
Definitely. I think any form of trauma warps not only the obvious things, but your sense of time. So you can be in a stasis really for decades and not really be aware that your life is passing you by. You think you're coping, you think you're getting through things. And I think that sense of time, I think the 25 years for Eve since this trauma had happened to her is an extremely long time. And yet she was still the product of something that had happened all those years ago. And the idea of time going very, very fast in Enanti, it was quite a neat solution, obviously, in lots of ways for a writer, but it was also meant to symbolize dreaming, because again, we can have a huge experience when we're asleep in our dreams, and they apparently happen in a matter of seconds in reality. So it was mirroring that as well, that you can go down to places in your subconscious and spend an awful lot of time there, while in reality not a lot of time has gone past. Likewise, you can spend an awful lot of time in what we call reality and not really be aware of how frozen and stuck you are.
On that note, on dreams deal with subconscious thoughts as they do in the novel. What did you learn about dreams in this context?
Well, I think I've always been interested in dreams, not just my own, but everybody's dreams. I think they're phenomenally important. I think they're there to help process an awful lot of things that we think during the day or experience. So I think on an unconscious level, what I've learned through dreams, not just from writing the book, but what I was already aware that I'd known, was they're already processing and sorting out an awful lot of things whilst you sleep. But for those that you actually remember and you can consciously recall, I think that you can learn a lot from them as well. I'm a great one for sort of writing them down, thinking about why I felt that. Why did I feel uncomfortable? Why did I feel such elation? So there's incredibly strong emotions that you can experience while you're asleep. And I like to think that with dreams, what they really do is make you ask questions of yourself. You might not really know the answers, but it's quite an interesting exercise to think why a certain thing happening in a dream provoked such a response in you and why it played out the way it did.
That's why it's frustrating, I suppose, when you wake up and you can't remember a dream and you know it meant something.
Yes, and you can still feel sometimes the emotion it brought up, and you can't remember anything else about it, but they can be extremely powerful things.
If people out there do get interesting dreams and they don't write them down, they can be very telling.
They can, and I wanted to use it as a technique as well, that when in a conventional life, we say someone's had a dream and then they wake up and they live their conventional life. When someone has suffered severe trauma, there's less of a separation between those things. It's less clear where certain things begin and certain things end. And I wanted to kind of bring that into the book, that it could be a fantasy world or it could be something else. It could just be part of her daily life and where she escapes to in her head. And I wanted that ambiguity to be there.
That's something that I really enjoyed reading, and particularly rereading when I was really going into it, that you do have the dreams that we can see that she is likely, I suppose use the word likely, experiencing in London just in her day-to-day, when she's sleeping in her day-to-day life. And then some of those glimmers from the dreams do come back into Enanti.
Yes.
Which was wonderful, because that really does make you think, what is Enanti? And makes you think more about dreams in general.
Absolutely. And they can be very, very circular. You can incorporate all sorts of different things. You can dream a repetitive dream that you know you've dreamt before, and even as you're dreaming you can think, oh my gosh, I've been here before. So it's a bending of reality, and it's a playing with what our concept of reality actually means.
I wanted to leave this till a little bit later on, but again, I could be completely barking up the wrong tree here, because there is a lot to kind of put your own thoughts into with this book. But you've got Layla, the sister of Eve, who is a massive reason for the grief in the book. And then you've got these people in Enanti. You've got Sula, and I'm going to try and say her name, Alette,
yes.
And I'm not going to spoil the story there. There is something else with these characters that is kind of makes my question irrelevant almost, but you don't learn that until later. So I'm going to still go with my question. Was this idea of kind of womanhood, and obviously they're young girls mostly, was there a theme here with siblings and sisters and women?
I think there was, but in the sense that what she had lost when she was little, so she lost her sister Layla in really horrific circumstances. And I think part of me has been thinking this for about 10 years now, that in some ways you can only find what you've lost by revisiting that sort of situation. And I've thought that about war, interestingly. And Eve actually carries that through in the book, that she has lost so much in war. And it's by going back into a conflicted land that she can actually start looking for these things again. And the same thing, I think, with this idea of this young girl who died, who was her sister. And she's very drawn to these other young girls that she then comes across. And I think that is inevitable. She feels a deep sense of guilt and shame over not being able to save her sister. And so I think any opportunity to help save or help in any way a younger child who could look up to her and depend on her and need her, I think is a very powerful urge.
Mm-hmm. Talking of war, there is a relevant parallel in Enanti, and you've got a reading for us, I believe.
So this is a section where the shadow beast, who is this sort of very ambiguous, dark character from Enanti, who is currently controlling that land when she first enters Enanti. It's a meeting where she actually meets him face to face and talks with him. So this chapter is called Adrift in the Darkness. I needed to trust in myself. When the shadow beast visited me in my dreams that night, he knew he had my acceptance. He had told me to come alone, told me what would happen to the others if I did not. His voice was silky, seductive. I was tumbling through the night. He held me in my bed and opened his vast wings around me. In them I saw a million worlds. There was the sensation of flying, being carried off, and then I was dumped abruptly on a cold stone floor. In front of me was a heavy wooden door which was open to reveal stone steps leading down into the earth. I climbed down and down the steps, spiralling down into the darkness. As my legs started to burn with the effort, I reached the gates at the bottom. They were incongruous here, down this deep under the earth. They could have graced any palace with their grandeur. They appeared to be made of metal, but were so smooth that they could not have been beaten into shape. Around the edge and down the centre, precious stones nestled in intricate settings, as if 1,000 rings had been set here, suggesting promises made. As I pushed on them, the gates swung open. Light flickered around me in the gloom of the chamber I had entered. It was vast, and I couldn't properly see across to the other side. It was built in the design of a full gladiatorial arena. No pillars were in evidence to hold up the ceiling that I knew must be there. From the number of steps I estimated, I was at least 0.5 kilometre underground. The aisle led gently down to the circular area in the centre, and around this terraced stone seating sloped upwards, staggered by the slope. Set at exact intervals along the stone seats were stubby, lit candles, thousands upon thousands of them. The light they gave off flickered and wavered, sending an eerie glow throughout the chamber. They reminded me of the stands of candles in church, remembering the dead. It should have been beautiful, and in a way it was, but the room felt numbingly cold. I wondered what the creatures that dwelt here would have to commemorate, what peace they were searching for. The same as you. The voice was everywhere, deep and sonorous, running right through me and stealing my breath. Where are you? I managed, hoping that my voice held firm. A snort of derision. I am everywhere, Eve. Haven't you worked that out yet? Each word sounded as if it had come from a different corner of the chamber, and I spun around trying to keep up with them, until I realised the futility of my efforts. If you want me to reduce myself to something you can simply see, if that would give you some false sense of similarity, then I can. But I had hoped for better from you. That voice, so honeyed and rich. As it spoke, it seemed to create harmonies within itself, pitching each word at myriad different notes simultaneously, chiming so melodically. I'm not afraid of you, I shouted into the gloom, and the force of it sent the candles closest to me, flickering madly. A deep chuckle followed, and then a silent pause. Oh, Eve, you do amuse. Of course you fear me. How can you not, when you don't understand what I am? And the amusement continues, because if you did fully understand what I was, then you'd be even more afraid. You are afraid of some things that you know, but above all you fear those things that you know are out there but you don't understand. Out there in the dark. That is me, Eve, the one that is out there in the dark, always there and waiting. Waiting for what? I asked. For you. My heart ran cold as I heard the truth in his words. What do you want from me? I asked on a whisper. I want all of you, Eve, your strength, your heart, I want your soul. These last words were whispered, but they reverberated around and around the room like an echo that had been trapped underground. I shivered violently from the frost in his words. Look around this chamber. See all these candles? You were wondering what creatures from this land would be commemorating, yearning for. Oh, we yearn, Eve, believe me. The power of our longings would leave you appalled. I know what yearning is, just as you do. Yes, I know how much you yearn, Eve. It rolls off you in waves. and I can help you. All you need to do is surrender to those feelings, give in to them, and come back to me, come back home. With me, you would satisfy those longings. You would take vengeance on those who have wronged you. You could rain fire down on your enemies. Wouldn't you like to see them writhe in agony? I know that you have thought those feelings, but I also know that they've been there. And I can show you such dark magic that your family would live again. I could feel myself leaning into the seduction in his voice, wanting the release that he hinted at. His voice was warm, delicious, spreading through my body. I shook. Eve, Eve, he breathed, I am unbridled power. I can answer all your heart's desires. You have become very powerful, but this is nothing compared to what I can give you. You have always thought that darkness was simply the absence of light, haven't you? Oh, Eve, that was never true. There is a whole world out here in the darkness, seething with life. The shadows are where the real power lies. The true passions of mankind lie here, waiting to be harnessed. I can show you worlds.
As much as it is about grief and working through that and the trauma, there's so much hope in the book.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, actually, because that was something I found very important to write. I wanted to write something that was deeply hopeful, but not shying away from some pretty dark topics. Great believer that life is hugely precious, and I wanted that to come through, even from that fractured background in Eve's case, that she finds some hope too.
Well, no, yeah, it definitely does. I mean, she has a very long journey. We get an idea of how long this journey is. It's in the book, you know, we see her thoughts and how things are changing. But yes, there is so much hope in it. What did you want the readers to take away?
From the ending itself, or just generally?
In general.
I think in general, I'm going to go back partly to what I said earlier and say that I like the fact that different readers might take different things. I've really enjoyed that, actually, and some of the feedback and comments I've had have been really fascinating to me, to see how different mindsets can read the same thing and come up with very different readings of it. But I also wanted, when I was sitting down to actually write it, I suppose I wanted to give an exploration, not necessarily any answers, but an exploration into long-term trauma and the dislocation that can bring and the disassociation from reality. And I think for two reasons. One is I think that can be quite helpful and useful for people to see that haven't had any experience of that in their lives, and helps them to understand better what may be happening in the life of someone that they know. But I also think that literature and art in general is something very special for feeling acknowledged and recognised. You can see parts of your own reality represented on a page or in a painting or in a piece of music, and it can connect you back not only to yourself but to the rest of the world, and I find that a very powerful thing.
That's a very good point, and that gives a lot to think about.
Don't think that you need to have experienced the sort of trauma that Eve has in the book to be able to connect with that character and her struggles. I think we all face things in our lives that we find difficult, and we all find that there are certain things that are very, very difficult to overcome. So again, it comes back to that universality. Although I did use a very particular setup for Eve, that she'd lost her family and she was extremely traumatized individual, I also think that some of the themes that she has to work through are pertinent to an awful lot of people.
Yeah, there are things to relate to, definitely, I think. What is the impact of long-term grief and trauma if not dealt with?
That's a very good question. I think you can see from Eve's character what would have happened if she'd done absolutely nothing, because although her dreams kept surfacing and her subconscious did keep nudging her, I think you can live in a very closed down way for a very, very long time. And I've seen that not just in the people around me and who I've known. I've been there myself. I definitely have been through large parts of my life where I felt very shut down and felt quite disconnected from the reality playing out around me, and yet very confused about the reality that I had in my head, that people couldn't see this. Can they not see that the world is like this? And I found that very disorientating, actually. And I've tried to put some of that into the scenario that Eve lives through and the way that she is trying to find a way forward. But I think when it's left completely, I think you can literally live through your life and waste your whole life. And you're in a prison almost. It's not your choice to waste that time, but it's a very hard thing to break out of that prison. Very difficult.
I think she is in her 30s, which in herself, obviously you see that and you go, gosh, put it together with the age that she was when she experienced what she did.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem. When you experience trauma in childhood, I think it sets patterns for the rest of your life that take an awful lot of unpicking, because you're still developing. You're a developing being far more as a child than you are when you're older. And I think these things have such a profound effect when they happen to you in childhood that the impacts aren't really even fully known to us yet. And it's a very interesting one that you can find a way that works for you. You can find a coping mechanism, whether that's alcohol and being very sort of promiscuous in Eve's case, or other people might choose to go down the route of drugs, or other people might choose to go down the route of just working really hard and covering up their trauma in a sense of I'm fitting in, but nobody really knows what I'm feeling on the inside. But I think that you set those patterns, you learn that you can cope with them, and therefore there's not a huge motivation to change them, worryingly.
Mm-hmm. So you've told us about your own background and we've heard about this book. Was there any sort of cathartic feature of writing the book for you?
Again, that's a really good question. I have been asked that before. I would say that for me, it happened the other way round, that my experiences I couldn't look at for a very long time. But again, they did keep nudging to the surface. And over many years, I started looking at them more and more deeply and more eye to eye. So, for example, my PhD was on Iraq, but it was very much geopolitical, looking at it very academically. So it was a subject I couldn't leave, but at the same time, I couldn't look at it in a very personal way. And as the years went by, I was able to look at it in an increasingly personal way and look at, rather than thinking, why did this happen to us? I started being able to move to, okay, what next? This has happened. What next for us? What's next for me? And so I think all of that work, that cathartic work, as you say, was done before I was able to write something like this. Because to write this, I had to take myself back out of that scenario and write it about another character who's not the same as me. She has glaring differences and obviously some similar emotions in some ways, but she's a very, very different person. And I needed to be able to get to the point where I could create something new and different and step out of it again. So cathartic, yes, but only in the sense of the catharsis came before being able to put it down on paper.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to something completely different. What's next?
Oh, now that is it's a tough one. I have my hands quite full at the moment with my children, and I'm beginning to feel that prickle of an urge to create again, which I haven't really had the brain space to feel for a very long time. I'm also a painter, so I write and I paint, and the thing that I'm finding easiest to pick up with the little chunks of time I get at the moment is actually the painting. But I know that as my time increases and I get longer and longer chunks, that it will move back to the writing as well. I found that I had an idea for my next book, and I had it when I was newly pregnant with my little baby. And I just couldn't get the time in my brain, really, the space in my head to sit down and get any of it decently out on paper. But the idea is there, and I think it's a good idea, but I haven't had the time to play with it yet. But that is my longer term goal.
It could be definitely one of those things where it's kind of been percolating in your head and it comes out and it's wonderful.
I do hope so. I think that's the way I do work. I have to be honest, that a lot of it's done with me staring off into space and not really looking at it directly. And then things start to cohere and make sense and form their own structure. And it's finding that space, because at the moment it's just not there. And that chance to sort of go off in a bit of a trance and stare out the window isn't really work with 4 children at home all the time. But that time will come back, and I know that this idea has something about it that won't let go of me. So I really do want to explore it. And it's to do with motherhood and the link between children and mothers.
Yeah, I'm going to read that, definitely. No pressure, though. Take your time. But no, you said about the attention and stuff there, and I thought when reading The Shifting Pools, the amount of time that, reading it and seeing how in depth it is, and I mean, I did get to a place where I was looking at every sentence, because I knew that there was so much to everything that I was thinking of every sentence. What is she saying here? What's she saying here? It must have been very busy in your head when you were writing.
Hugely busy, but that tends to be the way I work. I have to be saying things at multiple levels, or I find it flat for me. I find that I have to be making little connections everywhere, and that's just how my brain functions. And I've had days where I had about 300 pieces of paper on my floor, and I was standing over them, trying to then put them all into orders, but still keeping the spiderweb links that I enjoyed between different parts. And I'm hoping that comes through in the writing. And I'm hoping it doesn't sort of make it too complex in some ways, but I think it allows people to take what they want out of a reading. I think they can take it on lots of different ways.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is also easy to read, which is kind of strange to think because there's so much in it. But no, it is good in that way. So, The Shifting Pools is out now, published by Lightning Books, and links are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed this podcast, do subscribe for future episodes. Zoe, it's been fantastic having you here today and hearing everything about your book. It's given me so much more to think about, and also kind of clarified and made me feel good about the stuff that I thought I got right. So it's kind of nice in that way. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And I've loved the chats as well. I really have enjoyed talking about all the bits of the book you brought up, and you've asked some fantastic questions, and it's made me think. So thank you very much.
Join me on Monday, the 25th of May, when I will be talking to Terry Fleming, author of Perception, which is a sequel to Pride and Prejudice that looks at the futures of Mary and Kitty. It's gonna be good. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 14, was recorded on the 5th of May and published on the 11th of May 2020. Music and production by Charlie Place.